welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I didn't start questioning who I was because I wanted to shock anyone. I started because one ordinary, embarrassing request to my mother forced me to stop lying to myself. I've spent a long time looking for the right words to tell this story, because it's easy for people to hear crossdressing and immediately fill the silence with assumptions I've never asked them to make. But my life, at least the life I'm describing here, hasn't been a spectacle. It has been quiet. It has been ordinary in all the ways that matter: school, family dinners, awkward friendships, anxiety I didn't know how to name, and the slow work of growing up. The difference is that, inside all that ordinary life, there was a private question I carried like a stone in my pocket, small enough to hide, heavy enough to change the way I walked. When I was a kid, I didn't have language for identity. I didn't have a framework for gender as something you could explore with care, or something you could question without it becoming a crisis. In my world, you were either normal or you were a problem, and nobody explained the categories because everybody acted like they were obvious. I was a sensitive kid, the kind who noticed tone of voice more than words. I learned early how quickly adults could tighten their faces when something made them uncomfortable. So I became a student of comfort. I watched what made people relax, what made them laugh, what made them proud, and I tried to become that. Some of my earliest memories are about clothing, but not in the way people think. I don't remember feeling as sexy or trying to be provocative. I remember texture, color, and the strange calm that would come over me when I was alone and didn't have to perform. I remember being fascinated by how different fabrics seemed to carry different rules. There were clothes that meant to play, clothes that meant a school, clothes that meant to behave. And then there were clothes that, in my family and neighborhood, belonged to the other side of an invisible fence, clothes that were not for me, not because they were dangerous, but because they meant something about who you were allowed to be. I also remember the first time I crossed that fence, not dramatically, not with music swelling in the background, but with the small fear of a child doing something forbidden without knowing exactly why. I was home alone for a little while, the kind of alone time that felt like a whole private universe. I wandered into my mother's room the way kids do, curious and comfort-seeking at the same time. I opened a drawer I'd been told not to open, not because it was a moral line, but because it was adult stuff, and adult stuff had its own gravity. I won't describe anything in a way that turns it into something it wasn't. I'll just say this: I found an item of clothing that was clearly not meant for me, and I held it the way you hold something fragile. It felt like touching a secret. I didn't put it on then. I just held it, and my heart hammered like I was stealing. And what startled me most was not the fear, it was the softness that moved through my chest, like relief. For a moment, I wasn't thinking about being a good son or a tough kid or whatever role I was unconsciously rehearsing. For a moment, I felt like I could breathe in a different shape. Then I heard a car door outside, and my body snapped back into the rules. I shoved the drawer closed, washed my hands even though they weren't dirty, and sat on the couch pretending the TV was the only thing in the world. That was my pattern for years: reach for something true in private, then punish myself with normalcy the second I sensed the world returning. As I got older, the fence got taller. In middle school, people begin policing each other with a kind of cruelty that masquerades as humor. Masculinity, where I grew up, was not a broad landscape you could wander through. It was a narrow hallway with people waiting to shove you into the walls. I learned to laugh at jokes that made my stomach knot. I learned to lower my voice when I got excited. I learned to act like I didn't care about things I cared about. And I learned to keep that drawer in my mind locked, not just from others, but from myself. Still, the curiosity didn't go away. It waited. It came out sideways. Sometimes it showed up as envy when I saw someone allowed to be soft. Sometimes it showed up as a strange sadness after a school dance, watching girls and boys move in their assigned roles like it was all natural. Sometimes it showed up as anger, because anger was easier to explain than confusion. I didn't have the courage to say, "I don't know who I am." I had the courage to say, "Nothing matters," because that sounded like strength. In high school, I found the internet, and with it, I found both danger and relief. Relief, because I discovered I wasn't alone. Danger, because the internet is full of people who will gladly tell you what you are, whether or not it fits. I saw crossdressing presented in ways that didn't match my inner experience either as a joke, or as something sexualized, or as a humiliating secret. I didn't want any of those frames. I wanted something that felt like my real life, the quiet pull toward a different expression, the comfort of it, the fear of being found out, and the constant pressure to keep it all hidden under the label of a normal. I tried on identities the way a drowning person tries to grab floating objects. Maybe I was just curious. Maybe I was just weird. Maybe it was a phase. Maybe I was broken. Maybe I was lying to myself. Maybe I was lying to everyone else. Sometimes I told myself, with a kind of sternness, that I would grow out of it if I ignored it hard enough. Other times I promised myself I would deal with it later, as if identity was a bill you could leave unopened and it would stop arriving. At some point, it became less about clothing and more about honesty. The older I got, the more I realized I was living two lives, the life people saw, and the life I managed alone in my head. And the cost of that management was not trivial. It was anxiety. It was the constant monitoring of my own gestures, my own words, my own interests, like I was my own prison guard. It was a chronic tension in my shoulders. It was the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. I wish I could say I had one brave moment where I decided to be myself and everything got better. The truth is more ordinary. I made small decisions, and I lived with the consequences, and I learned what kinds of fear were warnings and what kinds of fear were simply the feeling of growing. The first time I actually dressed in a way that matched that hidden part of me, I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was trying to meet myself. I was alone. I had found a few items, nothing dramatic, nothing meant to be seen by anyone, and I remember standing in front of a mirror and feeling something like grief. Not because I looked wrong, but because I realized how long I'd been afraid of a version of me that wasn't hurting anyone. I remember whispering, out loud, to my reflection, "This is just clothes." But my voice shook, because it wasn't just clothes. It was permission. It was a boundary line I'd been told not to cross. It was the first time I saw my own face relax. Then the guilt arrived, as if on schedule. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to argue with myself like a lawyer. I tried to prove that this meant nothing, that I was still the person everyone expected. I tried to prove that I wasn't one of those people, whatever that meant in my mind. And in the middle of that argument, I realized something that made me stop. I was treating an entire category of human beings as a threat, and I was doing it in my own head. The fear wasn't only fear of being judged. It was fear of being connected to something I'd been taught to mock. That realization didn't instantly make me kinder to myself, but it forced me to see the structure of my shame. Shame isn't just a feeling. It's a lesson you learn from the world and then replay internally until it feels like your own voice. I started noticing how often people used a girly as an insult, how often softness was framed as weakness, how often men were taught that the only safe emotions were anger and laughter. I started noticing how much of my fear was really about social punishment, not about morality. And then life did what it always does, it brought me to a moment where private questions collided with public reality. I was in my early 20s, old enough to be responsible for myself, young enough to still feel like I needed permission to exist. A friend group I'd fallen into was planning a themed party, nothing wild, just a goofy costume night where everyone would dress as something outside their usual style. I told myself this was my chance to experiment in a socially acceptable way, to step a little closer to what I'd been hiding under the cover of, "It's just for fun." Part of me felt excited. Part of me felt terrified, because I knew what I was really reaching for wasn't a joke. It was relief. I started planning my outfit carefully, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel put together. I wanted to respect the version of myself I usually treated like a secret. I also wanted to do it responsibly, not stealing anything, not crossing anyone's boundaries, not treating it like a prank. The more I planned, the more I realized I needed some basic clothing items that I had never bought before. I tried ordering online and then panicked, imagining a package arriving with my name on it like a label. I tried telling myself I didn't need those items. But I did, not for any explicit reason, simply because outfits sit differently depending on what you wear underneath, and I didn't want to spend the whole night tugging at fabric, uncomfortable, feeling like I'd failed before I even started. And that's where the title moment comes from, the moment people hear and turn into a joke. I needed help buying a pair of underwear appropriate for the outfit. The reason I asked my mom wasn't because I wanted to drag her into something inappropriate. It was almost the opposite. My mother had always been the practical one, the one who could walk into any store, ask any question, and not shrink. She had a way of treating clothes as clothes, tools for living. Meanwhile, I was stuck in my head, drowning in shame. I realized that if I wanted to live with integrity, I had to stop making this part of me into a secret crime. And I trusted her more than anyone to respond with grounded reality rather than cruelty. Still, deciding to ask and actually asking were two different things. I rehearsed lines in my car like I was practicing a confession. I told myself to keep it simple, it's for a costume party, I need help finding the right thing, I'm embarrassed, can you help me? I told myself not to over-explain, because over-explaining can sound like guilt. I told myself I could back out at any moment. When I finally brought it up at home, my mouth went dry. We were in the kitchen, the most ordinary place in the world, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that the lighting was too bright for a conversation like this. My mom was doing something simple, sorting groceries, wiping the counter, and I stood there with the weight of years in my throat. I said, "Mom, can I ask you something kind of awkward?" She didn't look alarmed. She just looked at me the way mothers do when they sense the shape of a storm before it arrives. "Sure," she said. "What's up?" I could have lied. I could have made it purely about the party. I could have tried to keep it shallow. But something in me was tired of shallow. I told her the truth in the simplest words I had. I said there was a themed party, and I wanted to dress in a way that wasn't typical for me, and I realized I didn't know how to buy certain basics, and I felt embarrassed. I said I didn't want to do anything disrespectful or weird, I just wanted to do it properly and feel comfortable. And then, before fear could snatch the words back, I added, also, it's not only about the party. I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. I waited for the face tightening. I waited for the lecture. I waited for the sudden distance. I waited for her to say something that would make me fold into myself for another decade. My mom put down what she was holding. She looked at me steadily, not with excitement, not with disappointment, but with a kind of careful attention. "Okay," she said. "Just that." "Okay." Then she asked a question that changed my life, not because it was profound, but because it was humane. "Are you safe?" she said. Like, are you okay? It startled me. I realized how much of my own self-talk was about danger. As if clothing could make me unsafe, as if exploring expression would automatically lead to harm. Her question pulled the focus back to what actually mattered, my mental health, my well-being, my sense of self. I nodded, and then I shook my head, because I was both safe and not okay. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm anxious all the time. I feel like I'm hiding something. I don't want to disrespect anyone. I don't want to become someone I'm not. I don't know how to be honest without blowing up my life." My mom's eyes softened in a way I still have trouble describing. She said, "You're not blowing up your life by telling me you're confused." Then she paused. "And you're not doing something wrong by wanting to understand yourself. We didn't solve everything in that kitchen. We didn't label me. She didn't try to define my identity for me, and I'm grateful for that." She asked what I needed, practically. I told her what item I was trying to buy, and I said the word out loud, cheeks burning, feeling ridiculous for being a grown adult who couldn't name a piece of clothing without fear. She didn't laugh. She didn't tease. She treated it like any other shopping request. The next day, we went to a store. And yes, it was awkward. Not because she made it awkward, but because my shame was loud. I felt like everyone could see my thoughts. I felt like the cashier would know, like strangers would point, like the world would tilt. My mother walked beside me like it was Tuesday. She picked up a few options, checked sizes with the kind of experience I didn't have, and asked me quietly what would be comfortable. Her calmness didn't erase my fear, but it gave my fear something to lean against. What I remember most is the moment I realized my mother was not embarrassed of me. I had been acting like my feelings were a contagious stain. She was acting like my feelings were simply feelings, like a human being asking for help. That contrast created a kind of crack in my shame, and through that crack I could see a different future, one where I didn't have to punish myself for wanting to breathe. That night, at the party, I wore the outfit I'd planned. I didn't turn it into a performance. I didn't demand attention. I didn't drink myself into bravery. I simply existed in it. Some people complimented the costume in the casual way they would compliment anyone's effort. Some people didn't care. One or two made jokes that were supposedly harmless. I laughed politely, but I noticed how the jokes landed in my body like small stones. And then I noticed something else. I didn't crumble. I realized that part of my growth wasn't going to be convincing the world to be kind. Part of my growth was building enough self-respect that unkindness didn't define me. That didn't mean becoming numb. It meant becoming rooted. After the party, something complicated happened. I expected the experience to scratch the itch and then go away. Instead, it made the question clearer. It wasn't just about having fun at an event. It was about how I felt when I allowed myself a different expression. I felt calmer. I felt less like I was acting. And that terrified me, because calm can be more disruptive than chaos. Chaos is familiar. Calm makes you realize how much pain you've been tolerating. I began a period of my life where fear and reflection wrestled daily. On one side, I had the old rules: don't be weird, don't be judged, don't make your life harder, don't disappoint your family, don't give people ammunition. On the other side, I had a new responsibility. If I was going to be an adult with integrity, I couldn't keep living as a collection of lies designed to protect me from imaginary disasters. I made mistakes in that period, not the kind of mistakes that harm others, but the kind that come from not knowing how to hold a truth gently. Sometimes I overcorrected. I'd swing from secrecy to oversharing in a panic, as if I needed immediate validation to survive. Then I'd regret it and retreat. Sometimes I tried to set rules for myself like a strict parent: only at home, only sometimes, only if nobody knows, only if it doesn't mean anything. But, only if it doesn't mean anything, is a sentence that will break your heart, because it tells you you're allowed to exist only as long as you remain insignificant. My mom and I kept talking, in small honest conversations that didn't always end neatly. She asked me what I thought it meant. I told her I wasn't sure. I told her that, for me, it didn't feel sexual. It felt emotional. It felt like relief and self-connection. It felt like I was meeting a part of myself I'd been trained to hate. She listened, and sometimes she admitted she didn't fully understand, but she was trying. That mattered more than perfect understanding. My father was harder. Not because he was evil, but because he was a man built out of expectations he'd never been allowed to question. He loved me, but he loved me through a narrow definition of what a son should be. When I eventually told him, I tried to do it responsibly. I chose a calm moment. I told him I wasn't asking for applause. I wasn't asking him to announce anything to anyone. I was simply telling him the truth so I could stop lying. His face did the thing I'd feared for years: it tightened. He went quiet. He asked if I was doing drugs. He asked if I was confused because of the internet. He asked if I was trying to be someone else. And I felt a familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for existing. But something had changed in me by then. I realized I could love my father and still refuse to let his fear define my identity. I told him, gently but firmly, that I wasn't doing anything dangerous, that I was being careful, that I was still me. I told him I understood his discomfort, but I needed him to understand my mental health mattered. I told him I didn't want to live two lives anymore. He didn't suddenly become wise. He didn't give me the perfect response. He said things that hurt, mostly because they were clumsy and frightened. But he also didn't throw me out. He didn't disown me. He didn't become a villain. He became what many parents become when their child steps outside the map they were given, a person stumbling through discomfort, sometimes failing, sometimes trying. Over time, he learned to ask fewer accusatory questions and more practical ones. He learned, slowly, that this wasn't a rebellion designed to humiliate him. It was a human being learning to breathe. During that same period, I started taking my mental health seriously. Not in the performative way people talk about self-care, but in the real way. I found a therapist. I chose someone who had experience with gender expression and identity without forcing labels. In therapy, I learned to separate three things I had mashed into one knot: gender expression, gender identity, and sexuality. I learned that people can explore clothing without it being a kink. I learned that curiosity does not equal commitment. I learned that shame thrives in vagueness, and clarity, real clarity, not internet slogans, weakens shame. I also learned something harder: self-acceptance doesn't mean doing whatever you feel in the moment. It means acting with responsibility. It means respecting other people's boundaries, not using them as props for your growth. It means not turning your identity exploration into a secret life that harms your relationships. It means honesty, but not cruelty disguised as honesty. It means taking your time. As I grew more stable, I began to choose when and how I express myself instead of being driven by panic. I stopped treating clothing as a forbidden object and started treating it as part of my overall well-being. Sometimes that meant dressing in a way that felt more traditionally masculine because that's what I wanted that day. Sometimes it meant allowing myself softness. The point wasn't to replace one costume with another. The point was to stop living like my comfort was illegal. There was a period where I grieved. That surprised me. I thought acceptance would feel like celebration. Instead, it often felt like mourning. I mourned the years I spent afraid. I mourned the friendships I could have had if I hadn't been so guarded. I mourned the version of me who thought he had to earn the right to exist by being tough and unbothered. I mourned the fact that I had sometimes judged other people in order to keep myself safe. That grief was not a sign I was doing something wrong. It was a sign I was finally telling the truth. Eventually, the question shifted from a "what am I" to "how do I live well?" That question grounded me. It stopped being about labels and started being about integrity. How do I speak about myself with respect? How do I handle social situations without making them unsafe for me or uncomfortable for others? How do I date honestly? How do I build a life where I don't have to hide, but I also don't have to perform? Dating was one of the hardest parts, because it forced me into the real consequences of truth. It's one thing to explore privately. It's another thing to let someone close enough that your truth affects them. I didn't want to spring it on someone months into a relationship like a trap. I also didn't want to introduce myself with my deepest vulnerabilities like a warning label. I had to learn timing, and I had to learn how to speak without begging. I remember one person I cared about deeply. We were getting serious, and I could feel the old instinct to hide rising in me. I could also feel what hiding would cost, the slow poisoning of intimacy. So I told them, not dramatically, not during a fight, not as a test. I told them during a quiet evening, when we had space. I said, "There's something about me I want you to know because I respect you and I respect what we're building." I explained, calmly, that I sometimes explored my gender expression through clothing, that it wasn't about deceiving anyone, that it wasn't a joke, that it was part of how I understood myself. I told them I didn't need them to participate, I just needed honesty to be possible between us. They listened. They asked questions. Some were thoughtful. Some were clearly shaped by stereotypes. I answered what I could. And then, after a day or two, they told me they didn't think they could be comfortable with it. They weren't cruel, but they were clear. That rejection hurt in a clean way, like a wound that bleeds, but doesn't infect. It hurt because I liked them, and because I wanted to be chosen. But it also taught me something essential: compatibility isn't a moral verdict. Someone can be a decent person and still not be the right person for your life. And you can respect their boundary without turning it into proof that you're unlovable. Later, I met someone who responded differently. Not with instant perfect understanding, but with curiosity and kindness. They didn't treat me like a secret or a joke. They didn't demand I approve anything. They asked what it meant to me. They asked what support looked like. They asked what my fears were. And for the first time, I experienced what it felt like to be loved without having to amputate parts of myself to fit. By then, my relationship with my mom had matured into something I'm quietly proud of. We didn't talk about clothing all the time. We talked about life. But there was an underlying trust that hadn't been there before. And every once in a while, something would happen, an offhand comment from a relative, a news story, a joke on TV, and I'd see her glance at me, checking whether I was okay. Not in a way that made me fragile. In a way that reminded me I wasn't alone. My father, too, changed, though not in a straight line. He still struggled. He still sometimes said things that came from old fear. But I learned how to set boundaries without punishing him. I learned to say, I'm not discussing this if you're going to insult me, and then actually stop the conversation. That was a new kind of strength for me, not aggression, but steadiness. Over time, he learned that my identity wasn't an argument to win. It was a reality to relate to. And even when he didn't fully get it, he began to treat me with more respect, because I treated myself with more respect. The deeper acceptance came when I stopped using crossdressing as a referendum on my worth. I stopped asking, does this make me less of a man, and started asking, does this help me live with honesty? I stopped measuring myself against stereotypes of masculinity and femininity and started noticing the actual people around me. I saw men who were gentle and strong. I saw women who were fierce and tender. I saw people who didn't fit clean categories and were still worthy of love and safety. I began to believe, slowly, that I could be a whole person without being a perfect symbol of anything. I also became more careful about how I talked about this topic, especially in public spaces. I learned that not everyone is ready to hear it, and I learned that my job isn't to force readiness. I learned to choose trusted people, to build support, to protect my mental health. I learned that privacy is not the same as shame. Privacy can be wisdom. Shame is when you believe you deserve harm for being yourself. Privacy is when you understand that intimacy must be earned. There were still tense moments. Family gatherings where someone made a joke about a real man, and my stomach tightened. Work environments where I measured every word, not because I was hiding everything, but because I knew how quickly gossip can become a weapon. There were times I was tempted to lash out, to punish the world for being ignorant. But I kept returning to the same principle. I want my life to be guided by integrity, not reaction. Integrity meant telling the truth where it mattered, setting boundaries where it was necessary, and not turning my pain into someone else's problem. The biggest integration, the final phase of growth I didn't know I was heading toward, was when I stopped treating my identity exploration as a separate hidden chapter and started seeing it as one thread in the whole fabric of my life. I'm not only the person who crossdresses sometimes. I'm also the person who shows up for friends, who pays bills, who struggles with anxiety, who learns, who fails, who apologizes, who tries again. I'm the person who knows what it feels like to be afraid of being seen, and therefore the person who tries to see others more gently. If there's an educational point I hope lands for anyone listening, it's this: identity exploration is not automatically a crisis, and it's not automatically a performance. For many people, it's simply the slow process of aligning inner truth with outer life. It can be messy. It can be frightening. It can involve real consequences, like rejection, misunderstanding, or difficult family conversations. But it can also build empathy. When you know what it's like to be judged for something harmless, you become less interested in judging others for the harmless ways they try to breathe. Another point is that support doesn't have to be perfect to be real. My mother didn't suddenly become an expert on gender. She became a mother who chose her child's well-being over her own discomfort. That choice mattered more than flawless language. And my father didn't become a symbol of enlightenment. He became a person learning, slowly, sometimes awkwardly, that love is bigger than the rules he inherited. And maybe the most important thing I learned is that self-respect is not a feeling you wait for. It's a practice. It's how you speak to yourself when you're alone. It's whether you treat your own confusion with patience instead of violence. It's whether you seek help when anxiety starts swallowing your life. It's whether you allow yourself to grow without demanding that growth be painless. When I think back to that moment in the kitchen, the moment I asked my mom for help buying something I was ashamed to even name, I don't remember it as a scandal. I remember it as the first honest bridge I built between my inner life and the people who loved me. It was one small request, but it contained a bigger decision, to stop treating myself like a problem to hide and start treating myself like a human being worth understanding. I don't know what your story is if you're listening. I don't know what you're carrying quietly, what you've been taught to fear about yourself, what you've been told is unacceptable. But I know this, fear gets louder in isolation, and it gets quieter in the presence of careful truth. If you're exploring identity, do it with responsibility. Do it with self-respect. Do it with empathy for the people around you, and especially for yourself. And if the first step is simply finding one safe person to talk to, one person who can look at you and say, okay, that step can be enough to change the way you walk through your own life. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.